So here's a picture of what the tabletop looked like before I got started. And this was easily one of the most challenging projects I've tackled yet, and a lot of that had to do with just the size of material I was working with. I ended up having to build this workbench that you're seeing me roll outside the garage because my normal workbench, as you see in the foreground, just wasn't large enough to accommodate the slab of wood and then also the flattening jig that I'm using here. And this flattening jig, while you're only seeing me run it just a couple times, I ran this hundreds and hundreds of times over this slab of wood. I'd run one side, flip it over, do the other side. So this actually took me months to complete. And the reason for that was I didn't want to take off too much material. I wanted to preserve the thickness as much as possible. And I was worried if I took off too much material that it would start to warp on me. So it was just a lot of back and forth. I'd flip the slab over, do one side, flip it back, do the other side, let it sit for a while. So that process took a long time. So after a few months of flattening, it was time to kind of work on the sides of the table, start to get it down to its rough dimensions, start thinking about design of what I wanted it to look like. And here I'm just running an angle grinder over all the live edge slabs. The angle grinder has a turbo plane wheel attached to it, so it makes for very fast work of removing that loose material and bark, and it still gives it that live edge look and feel to it. So it's a really fast, easy way, and it also preserves the look of the piece. So now that I've finished the live edge sides, it's time to just cut it down to its rough dimensions. This way it gives me an idea of what the final size of the table might be. Just kind of helps me mark out things, start to visualize what it's going to look like. So I'm just quickly taking my skill saw and cutting it down to kind of a rough dimensional shape. So now it's time to start filling in all those deep cracks and voids in the table, and I'm using a deep pour epoxy for this that's dyed black. And while I thought the flattening process was the most time-consuming part of this project, this was easily the most time-consuming. I spent months doing epoxy fills, and a lot of that had to do with just the temperature and the humidity in my garage. I'd only get a day or two here that I would allow for good curing temperature and humidity, so I'd have to wait for the weather to kind of change. And then the amount of pours I ended up doing just kept stacking up. This red oak slab was just drinking the epoxy. So the first phase of it was to fill up these deep cracks. So I just used a syringe and I used a deep pour epoxy, and I'd fill up these cracks, let it cure, but just keep filling them until they completely filled up to the surface. So this is just one of maybe 5 or 6 different pours on each side. So each side got the same treatment. I was still back and forth about which side was going to be the top, so I figured I'd better take my time on both, make sure they both look really nice. Now here I've finally finished the epoxy, and it's time to sand, and you'll see that I have this glossy kind of look. And what I ended up doing was there's all these tiny little cracks in the top, and I wanted to make sure that the table just felt really smooth when you dragged your hand across it. So I ended up using almost like a skim coat epoxy on the top, and I knew I was going to have to sand all that off, but I just wanted to make sure that any tiny little crack was all filled in. And I was kind of hoping this would prevent the table from warping also, or absorbing moisture. So it was, fill in all these tiny little holes with a skim coat. So that's why you're seeing this glossy look on top of the table. And I'm not going to bore you guys with all the sanding I did on this, but of course, since I was sanding the epoxy, I needed a very aggressive grit. So I believe I started with almost a 40 grit, and I worked my way all the way up to 320. So there was a lot of sanding involved in this project. And so you're just seeing that first initial sand, and I did this for both sides of the table. So I thought all the epoxy pouring and sanding were all finished, but nope. After I'd done all that sanding, I realized that there's these tiny little fissures on the top of the table, and I just wasn't happy with that. I decided I'll bite the bullet and go ahead and do one more coat of epoxy, just injecting it with those syringes again. just to make sure that all those cracks are filled in and the table is really smooth when I was done. So what you're seeing me do now is just take a hand scraper and just scrape off that excess epoxy. And what that does is it really just cuts down on the time of sanding and saves me a few of those really expensive sanding discs I have. So while this was really frustrating, I felt that it was worth to just go back and do it right. So I finally finished all the re-sanding again of the tabletop, after that mix up with the epoxy, and I was really happy with how the top was feeling and looking. So I'd flipped the table over and it was time to start working on the base. And I was figuring out where I wanted to set the legs. And while I was doing this and kind of exploring design ideas, the table had been sitting about a month. And I started to notice that it warped a little bit. It maybe warped about 1/8 of an inch. And I just was concerned that it could continue to warp, or once it got in its final destination, it could warp a little bit. And this isn't very surprising considering it's a live edge slab and it's a really big tabletop. But in order to give myself a little bit peace of mind and give it some more strength, I decided to install these steel C-channels, and I installed 3 of them across the table. So here I'm just figuring out where the C-channel should sit in proximity to the legs. And now it's time to start routing in the holes for the C-channel to sit in. And I really took my time doing this. I started to get really nervous about where these C-channels should sit, and you'll see me go back and forth several times making sure that I have the depth dialed in correctly, just taking my time that I don't want the router to jump out and put a big gouge in the table. And while this is the underside of the table and no one's really going to see it, I just had worked so hard on it. I really wanted to make sure everything was perfect. So here's a close-up of the C-channel and how I attach it to the table. So clearly I've routed out the channel for it, and you see me just kind of cleaning up the edges with a chisel to make sure it sits in there nice and flush and just looks really clean. And the way it's attached are these threaded inserts. So I drilled these holes for the threaded inserts. You see them there in the foreground. And I just added a dab of CA glue to each insert to lock it in place. And then it just bolts on, and you just use an Allen key to attach the C-channel to the table. And so you can adjust these as needed. Here's a clip of what those C-channel looked like once I was finished, and I was really happy with the way they came out. They all sit nice and flush into the table, and they gave me a little bit of peace of mind that the table's not going to warp down the road. So after spending all that time installing the C-channel, it just felt wrong to just directly bolt the legs to the table. So I decided to go ahead and make this quick jig to route out a little recess for each leg base to mount to the table. So you'll see me just sticking some double-sided tape to some plywood. You'll see the little chalk line I have laid out of where I want the leg bases to sit. So I'm just taking my time to make sure they're in the right location. And then I have an acrylic plate just mounted to my router. Gives me a little bit easier time of running the router back and forth over that template. And I have a template bit in there. So it's just a matter of doing several shallow passes to get a nice clean cut for each of those legs. Now it's time to just do a quick dry fit of the legs, so I'm just dry fitting it in a couple taps with the hammer. And I think it was really worth spending the extra time to create this recess for each leg. It just gives the table a really clean look. Even though it's the underside of the table, I just felt like, you know, I've invested so much time into it, it's worth doing just these little extra details. Speaking of details, I decided to add these black walnut bow ties to the top of the table. And while they're not going to add any strength, I just thought they looked pretty cool to have that contrast between the two woods and give the tabletop a little bit of character. And finally, it's time to cut the table down to its final dimensions. So I'm just using my plunge cut saw for this task. Leaves a nice smooth cut. So after I cut the table down to its final dimensions, I used my trim router to add a pretty intense chamfer just to make sure that that edge isn't too sharp and it's not going to splinter. It gives the tabletop a clean look. Now it's time to just do a once over of some hand sanding on all the sides, so make sure I didn't miss any areas with the random orbit sander on the live edge sides. Then clean up that chamfer a little bit. Clean up just all the edges, just kind of break the edge so you don't have any sharp edges on the table, and just make sure everything's prepped and clean for the final finish. Now it's time to finally add the finish, and I'm using Rubio Monocoat for this. It's really easy to apply. You just lay it out with a squeegee. You can either use an electric buffer like I am here, or you can just do it by hand. I did a little bit of both, but it gives the wood a nice natural look. Easy to apply, just one coat, and then I ended up putting a little bit of natural wax on top, and it came out really nice. And here's just a short clip of the finished table. This was a huge project and huge table. It's about 3.5 feet on the narrow side, 4.5 feet on the wider side. The table's almost 9 feet long and about 2 inches thick, so a huge, huge project. I learned a lot during this project. It took me about 1.5 years to build. I'll have a list of all the tools and materials in the links below. I appreciate you sticking around for the entirety of the video, and with that I'll finish this video with a few of the pictures I took at the end of this. Thanks.